Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. All praise is due to Allah, and may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon our last Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. As our brother so gracefully introduced me, my name is Brother Yousuf Yi, James Yousuf Yi. And I'm an American-born Chinese-American citizen, and I accepted Islam in 1991. And today I would like to share with you my story, my journey, on how I came to Islam. First of all, it's a blessing to be here in this masjid, MCMC. I visited many times, especially when I was the director of CARE New Jersey back in 2011. And from that time on, I visited many of the mosques and masajid throughout New Jersey, both north and south. And alhamdulillah, I often visited here during the month of Ramadan and shared iftar with this community. So alhamdulillah, it's great to be back. But I grew up in New Jersey. I grew up in the town of Springfield in Union County. And as a youngster in America, a Chinese American, an Asian minority, I went through the public educational school system. And I was raised by my mother as Christian, as a Lutheran. My mother accepted Christianity. My mother and my father both are originally from China, but they also were born here. Today, my father is 91 years old. He was born here in the United States, in Pennsylvania. My mother's 83, and she was born in Brooklyn. It was my grandparents who came from China. But neither of my parents grew up with religion. But when my mother was older, she became a Christian. And so she raised myself and my two older sisters and two younger brothers in the Lutheran faith. And as a middle school student and as an elementary school student, I went to church on Sundays. I went to Sunday school every Sunday. And during the week, we participated in the church youth group. And when I was in 7th grade, I started what they called confirmation classes. 7th and 8th grade, where you learn about the details of the Christian doctrine. Christians who believe in the doctrine of the Trinity. And so in 8th grade, I was confirmed into the Lutheran. And after that, my mother said, now that you've confirmed and you understand Christianity, she no longer forced me to go to church on Sundays. And so now I was in high school. And I became less concerned and less interested in religion in general. I still considered myself a Christian. But I stopped going to church when I stopped participating in the church youth group. And I became more active in my high school in sports. I played soccer. How many people play soccer here? Lots of people. And I played varsity soccer for 2 years at Jonathan Dayton Regional High School in Springfield. And I also joined the wrestling team, where I became captain of my high school wrestling team and almost won the state championship in New Jersey. My high school year, I took 4th. I went to the state tournament twice. I won the regional championship. I won the county championships, the district championships. But in the state championship, I took 4th. I did well in academics as also. I was what they called a high school scholar athlete. And my grades in high school and my athletic achievements in wrestling got me accepted to one of the most prestigious educational institutions in the United States, known as West Point, the United States Military Academy at West Point. And the year I applied to go into West Point, There were over 13,000 applications, but only 1,300 were accepted. And I was one of those 1,300. And when you apply to the United States Military Academy, you have to get an endorsement, a nomination from a congressman or higher. And my local congressman gave me a nomination. I actually applied also for a nomination from the senator at that time. It was Bill Bradley. But I was late in requesting from him, and so I was denied from Bill Bradley. But my local congressman granted me a nomination. And then with my grades and with a good word from my high school wrestling coach, I got into West Point. Now when you get into West Point, there's no tuition, it's free. But you become an active duty service member in the U.S. military. And so you go 4 years at West Point, and after you graduate West Point, you have to serve in the U.S. military. You have a 5-year service obligation, active duty, and then 3 years in the reserve. So after I graduated West Point, I graduated somewhere near the middle of my West Point class. There were almost 1,000 people who graduated in my class. It was around 950, and I was at around number 600. But it was soon after I graduated West Point with a degree in management that I found myself involved in what you might call interfaith dialogue. So following my graduation, I had gone down to Washington, D.C. to visit a former student at West Point. She was at West Point for 2 years, and she had now left West Point. She didn't graduate from West Point, but she decided to continue her studies at Howard University. And after graduation, after visiting South Carolina with some of my classmates, we're now young second lieutenants in the U.S. military. Coming back to New Jersey, I stopped in D.C., went to visit one of my former classmates, and I met her roommate, who was also studying at Howard University. And she herself was studying Islam. But I didn't know that. But we had a discussion about faith in general. And I recall that weekend she asked me about my faith, and I told her that I was Christian, and I believed in the doctrine of the Trinity. And she told me to think about this idea, to believe in one God, but not to believe in Jesus as the Son of God. But in the Christian faith, you're taught that Jesus is the Son of God and part of the Trinity, one of the 3 parts of the Trinity. And this is what I had learned in my confirmation classes in 7th and 8th grade. And I came out and I told her, no, that's not what I believe. I'm a Christian. And what you're suggesting to me, I told her, is misguidance. Those are my exact words, misguidance. And she said, how can you call it misguidance? This is what I'm studying. It's Islam. This is what Muslims believe. How could you characterize something or judge something without knowing about it? And I thought about that and I said, that makes sense. I didn't know anything about Islam. So I said, that's right. I don't know anything about Islam. So I took it upon myself to learn about Islam, with the intention of going back to her someday when I visited again in Washington, D.C., and telling her, okay, now that I've studied Islam and know a little bit about it, I can say that it's misguidance. So when I came back to Springfield, and I was back in New Jersey, I went to the mall. Back then, there used to be a bookstore called Walden's. They no longer exist. Now it's Barnes & Noble. But I went to a bookstore called Walden's, and I bought a general book about Islam. It was called Introduction to Islam. And it was written not even by a Muslim. It was written by a non-Muslim. But it was a general book about Islam. And I purchased it, and I began to read about it. A week or so later, I was sent to El Paso, Texas, to begin my officer basic training. in the Air Defense Artillery. That was the branch that I was sent into when I graduated West Point, the Air Defense Artillery. So I was sent to El Paso, where Air Defense Artillery officers train. And while I was there were also visiting students from the UAE who were learning the Patriot missile system. Right? There were other officers who were also training from Egypt. And during my time in 1990, in the summer of 1990, Ramadan started while I was there. And I remember talking to some of the Egyptian officers, and they invited me into their quarters where they were staying on the base, where they would break the fast in Ramadan. And they shared with me food, and they told me that we're fasting now because it's Ramadan, and I had read about it in the book. And I remember during that time, not even as a Muslim, I was still learning and reading about Islam. I fasted 1 or 2 days. I broke fast with them, not even as a Muslim. And I remember reading from the book, being surprised, because I read about biblical prophets. Prophets that I had learned about when I went to Sunday school. Prophets like Moses, and Abraham, and Noah, and Joseph, and others. But when I read about this book about Islam, and I read that Muslims also believe in many of these prophets, that was something I didn't know, and I was surprised. I said, oh, Muslims believe a lot of what Christians believe. And it was very intriguing to me. And this is that commonality that I saw between Christianity and Islam was something which drew me to read more of that book. I finished my officer basic course, and at the tail end of my officer basic course in January of 1991, it was a time when President Bush, the first, George Bush, the father, sent troops to Saudi Arabia because Saddam Hussein had entered into Kuwait. I had just finished my officer basic course. I was now an officer trained in the Patriot missile system, and I had an assignment to be sent to Germany. But I had 2 weeks to spend back in New Jersey before I got shipped to my base in Germany. And I came back to Springfield. And I recall the young woman who was at Howard University who I had that interfaith discussion with was from Newark. And I found out where she lived. I went to Newark and told her I had read more about Islam and that I found it very truthful. That I was wrong when I had called it misguidance several months ago when I was in DC. And as I studied more about Islam from just general sources, she said, if you find this as true, then you should become a Muslim. And she guided me to a small masjid, a small mosque in Newark, New Jersey, on Chancellor Avenue, called the Masjid Beit al-Khaliq. And I went there, and at the time there was an imam serving from Ghana. And I professed the Shahada in April of 1991. And less than a week later, I was sent to Germany to serve as an air defense artillery officer in the United States Army. And going to Germany, one of my concerns was, I'm now a new Muslim. I don't really know anything about Islam except what I read in the general book. However, being a new Muslim, I thought of myself as someone who would just be what I called a normal Muslim. Because that's how I was as Christian. I was just a normal Christian. I didn't go to church every Sunday. I wasn't in Bible studies every night. I wasn't out trying to convert people to Christianity. I was just a regular Christian. So when I became Muslim, I had the same idea. I would just be a normal Muslim. Someone who believes in one God, but also believe in the prophets, the Quran, and the books, and the angels, the Day of Judgment. Of course, that was something I believed in as a Christian, the Day of Judgment and forgiveness. Right? But I would just be a regular Muslim. But when I got to Germany, I was on an air base, and there weren't many Muslims in the area of where I was stationed, in Bitburg. And it wasn't until several months later where I came across some Muslims who were serving in the Air Force in Germany, and they told me, yeah, we have a chapel, we have a Muslim chapel, we have a mosque on the base. It was more than an hour and a half away from where I was on the German Autobahn. Right? And one of the free weekends I got, I eventually went down to a city called Kaiserslautern, we called it K-Town, where there was a larger American community where there were a lot of Americans serving in the military and their families. And then there was a small American Muslim community on the base.